Today we're going to be looking at chapter 25 in the biology Life on Earth textbook. And so we're actually continuing our two-part series on animals. Um, Early on we looked at diversity of plants, and then last time we looked at diversity of invertebrates. But now we're actually going to be looking at the diversity of vertebrates specifically. So this is again chapter 25, Animal Diversity Part 2. So looking at it at a glance, we're going to be talking about the key features of the chordates and the major animal groups that are in the chordates, as well as spend some time looking at the vertebrates specifically. So humans, that's us in case you're wondering, we are a member of the taxonomic group known as chordates or chordata. And so this is going to include a lot of what you traditionally think of as animals, whereas the invertebrates included lots of things you typically didn't associate with animals, like sponges, and you probably didn't immediately jump to sea stars or starfishes or lobsters or crabs or earthworms or insects, but those are all animals. However, typically when we think of animals, we think of uh, animals with a vertebrae or a vertebral column. And so we'll get into that towards the end. So what unites chordates together? Um, First off is that they share four distinct structures, and that's going to include deuterostome development, which interestingly enough also includes the echinoderms, and that's sort of the exception to the rule. Last time we did talk about deuterostome development and versus protostome development, and your textbook um, gave a couple, gave actually only one feature of what separated out deuterostomes and protostomes. So it was interesting because there's a whole set of features that actually helps separate them out. And so if we type in protostomes, kind of kind of a confusing one. Okay, not even anywhere clear. Uh, it's interesting because well, they have two holes. Well, we have two holes. We have a mouth, and then we have what comes out the other end, the mouth or the anus. And in protostomes, the mouth is actually going to develop from that first opening, and then the um, anus is going to develop later on. And so if we look at difference between a protostome and a deuterostome, it involves that first opening called the blastophore. It's part of that hollow ball of cells that forms, after an egg is fertilized. They all start to divide, and then they form sort of this ball. And so let me look up deuterostomes. Deuterostomes. Let's see how close I got. Deuterostome. And then what does deuterostome mean? So we did talk about how they include the bilaterally symmetrical animals. Also the type of cleavage that forms, and so it has to do with, again, that hollow ball of cells and how they split apart, how they sort of split, and in what orientation and direction they do. And also, um, that that opening that forms in that ball of cells, the mouth is not the first thing to form, but the anus is. One thing we didn't really talk about in invertebrates is that um, some of those, like the sea star, only really had one opening, so it's a shared mouth and anus. So once you ingest your food, you sort of digest it, and then you, I guess, just spit it back out technically. I guess since you don't have a complex digestive tract, it's probably not considered uh, defecating it out or pooping it out. I imagine it's sort of like spitting it out, but I guess that's sort of a philosophical question. But anyway, I did want to talk about how deuterostome and protostome is way more complex than what it was listed in that last lecture. So I didn't want to take a time to go back to it. But anyway, chordates, deuterostomes. And here are the four features of uh, the chordates. So postanal tail, pharyngeal gill slits, a nodal cord, and a dorsal nerve cord. And if you're thinking, I don't think I have any of those, we'll get into that. So the nerve cord of chordates, it lies above the digestive tract, and it runs lengthwise along the dorsal portion, the upper portion of the body. Um, the hollow center of the nerve cord is filled with fluid, and it develops a thickening at its anterior end that becomes a brain. So pretty important thing for managing like the different kinds of nervous systems and the central nervous system in the case of cephalization specifically. So the nodal cord, it's a stiff rod that extends along the length of the body between the digestive tract and the nerve cord. So it can actually provide an attachment site for muscles, and that goes into my earlier question. Well, where do humans lie on this? We have these features, but where are they? Uh, Turns out it's only present in early stages of development and disappears later as the skeleton develops. Pharyngeal gill slits, they are located in the pharynx, which is the cavity behind the mouth. Most people will call that a throat, but again, depends upon the anatomy of your organism you're looking at. And so these slits function as openings for gills, and gills are important for aquatic organisms. And they allow you to exchange gas in water. And again, well, humans that are born, by the time you're a baby, after you finish development in the womb, you no longer are going to really have these gill slits. They only really appeared as grooves early in your development. Post-anal tail, well, it's kind of what it sounds like. Um, it's it's a little bit of a tail. I don't know what to tell you. So the post-anal tail contains muscle tissue and the rear most portion of the nerve cord. And so that post-anal tail actually doesn't have to be super big. It definitely varies a lot. And so most people would say humans, typically we wouldn't define ourselves as having a tail, but we do have like a rudimentary like leftover approximation of the structure in adults. So this is looking at a human embryo. Obviously, like we are not going to be born outside the womb with this tail. Um, Here we go with this tail. And actually, this doesn't really look much like a human at all. So if you've ever seen well, a baby in the womb, if you've seen pictures of them, baby humans and other like vertebrate animals can look kind of similar to each other when they're early in their development. It's kind of strange, kind of odd that we look so hideous. All right, so looking at the chordates, breaking them down a little bit further, we have the tunicates, the lancelets, and the craniates. So the tunicates, that's going to be a group of about 2,300 species of marine um, invertebrate chordates. So they are small, filter feeder, sort of cylindrical, and they also can go by the name of the sea squirt. So we're going to have a picture of that. Again, it's really strange to think of this as an animal, but it is. Uh, but it is. So going back to these features, um, dorsal nerve cord, notochord, dorsal nerve cord, notochord, pharyngeal gill slits, and postanal tail. It's so interesting because most of what we typically think of as an animal doesn't really exhibit full versions of those as an adult. So when we think of animals, we think of the vertebrates, which again are a subsection that we're going to get to in a bit. But right now, okay, so chordates broken down into tunicates, lancelets, and craniates. And here is a picture of the lancelet. So they're really tiny and they're fish-like. Um, and they actually retain all four of those features we just mentioned as an adult. So they're fish-like, but they really aren't fishes. In fact, we'll get into what a fish is in a bit. All right, looking at the craniates, interestingly enough, they have a cranium, they have a skull. And that skull, its purpose is to enclose the brain. So it can be composed of either bone or cartilage. And cartilage is tissue that's kind of like bone, but it's less brittle, more flexible. So think of human ears, or your ears, since you are most likely a human watching this, and part of your nose, the end part is made of cartilage. So among the craniates, we have the hagfishes and the vertebrates. So the vertebrates, they're animals in which the embryonic notochord is replaced in development by a backbone, or as I mentioned earlier, a vertebral column. And this vertebral column can be composed of bone or cartilage, of a mixture, or both. Hagfishes, the interesting thing about them is that they lack jaws. Instead, they use this really weird tongue-like thing um, to to grind and tear at food. So imagine if you didn't have a jaw, you couldn't then have teeth, so you just have to put teeth on your tongue. No big deal, right? And here's a picture of a hagfish. Interesting thing about it is for defense, it secretes this really gross slime-like material. So they actually just like to, uh, hook on to something. But what's interesting about these, aside from the fact that they are marine, is they have a two-chambered heart. And among them, they are what you would refer to as colloquially as cold-blooded. So the technical term for that is ectothermic. So their body temperature depends upon the temperature of their external environment. So they can't regulate their own body temperature. Now moving on to the vertebrates, they have a vertebral column. It supports their body, provides attachment site for muscles. It protects the delicate nerve cord and brain. And it's actually part of a living internal skeleton that can grow and repair itself. Anyone that's ever broken a bone know that you have to have it set back correctly because that bone will have a tendency to grow back. And if you put it closely another to bridge together so that that material touches again, There's both a living part and sort of a non-living external part of a bone. So the whole thing is not fully like alive, but per se. So the strongest parts, of course, are going to be the parts that are more non-living, and which is supported then by the living cells. So there's a whole complex thing between osteoblasts and osteoclasts, but we won't really get into that now. And so moving on, let me see, continuing. Okay, so uh, early vertebrates, the first kinds of organisms you see are jawless fishes, so fishes without a jaw. Um, and many of them had actually had bony armor plates. And then jaws in fishes uh, arose about 425 million years ago. So the purpose of jaws, I think we all know. I mentioned earlier, they are attachment site for teeth, unless you have, like the hagfish, a tongue in which you want to put your teeth on. But for us, we prefer a jaw. So it allows fish to grasp, tear, and crush their food. So different kinds of teeth type. Not all teeth are the same. Even among a human, you have canines, you have molars. Canines, of course, are used for tearing. Molars are used for crushing and grinding. And even the way the teeth um, are set in our jaw um, differs among different species. So it's interesting because not all species have different teeth type, and nor do they attach in the jaw the same. So it's referred to as their dentition. So we're not going to dive too deep into that, but it's something that once you see, you can't unsee. So I'm a big sci-fi nerd, and one thing I notice is that so humans have different teeth types and different shapes, is that not all species do. Um, those that have less evolutionary advance, we'll just put it that way, will have similar teeth type across their whole mouth. Imagine a human in which all their teeth looked exactly the same. It will look creepy, kind of alien-like. And believe it or not, anytime start paying attention, you're watching, I don't know, like Alien versus Predator or some movie in which there's this creature, that fictional creature that they made up that didn't exist before. Look at their teeth type. Their teeth are most likely all going to be the same shape and size. And that actually contributes to the sort of alien aspect of it because it's so different than what we are used to seeing. Again, hope I didn't like ruin your day again. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Aliens tend to have teeth that are all the same shape and size, and it's creepy. Vertebrates, they extend outside of water, so they can be aquatic. They can also exist on land as well, terrestrial. So for that, you're going to need paired appendages. In fish, they start off with those paired appendages, their fins, and they can stabilize them for swimming. However, some fins were modified so that they sort of function as legs that allow them to crawl onto land. And then later on, those kind of limbs were modified into wings that allow animals to take flight. So different groups among the vertebrates, the lampreys, the cartilaginous fishes, the ray-finned fishes, which I know is not a reference to Ray and Finn from Star Wars. Um, the coelacanths, the lungfishes, the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals. Okay, that was a really lame joke for Star Wars, but moving on. So the lampreys, some can parasitize other fish, so they can serve as a parasite, so attached to other fishes and steal nutrients and resources from them. So parasitism is a type of a symbiotic relationship, so which is a close association between two animals or plants or organisms. So it's a symbiotic relationship in which one organism benefits and the other is adversely affected or harmed. Uh, So I'm going to jump ahead. And here is a picture of one. And yes, that's his head slash mouth structure. That's one of the, so I don't believe that those are, I don't think those are true teeth. Um, or at least they're not the typical like teeth type who we think of, which is what I was mentioning earlier about how dentition actually differs wildly, and those actually do all look really similar in shape and size. So again, once you see it, you can't unsee it. All right, cartilaginous fishes, chondrichthyes. So those include sharks, skates, and rays, and they have jaws and a cartilage-based skeleton. They also have leathery skin and scales. So again, you see how those teeth are similar in shape and size, really terrifying. So they have internal fertilization, which allows sperm to be deposited directly into a female's reproductive tract. They can be filter feeders, or they can be predators. Skates and rays, they mainly hang out at the bottom of the ocean. They're really flat and they have wing-shaped fins and thin tails. Some have a spine near their tail that's used for defense, and then others produce an electric shock that can stun prey. Ray-finned fishes, actinopterygii, they're unique because their fins are formed by webs of skin supported by bony spines, and so they have skeletons made of bone. And their skin has interlocking scales. And then they also use a swim bladder, which allows them to float at any level they want, any level in the water. And so that's really considered kind of like an evolutionary modified lung. So different forms of ray-finned fishes, and they range from snake-like eels to flattened flounders. They can also be predators that are streamlined or bottom feeders. So here we have a different example. Again, look at the teeth on that eel. Imagine a human with teeth like that. Then we have uh, the coelacanths and the lungfishes, which have lobe fins. And the 6 species of lungfishes are found in freshwater habitats in Africa, South America, and Australia. And they have both gills and lungs. And so that lung is an adaptation for their environment, which typically is low in oxygen. And so they're called lobe fins because they are fleshy fins that contain rod-shaped bones surrounded by a thick layer of muscle. And some of these fleshy fins could be modified to be used as legs. And really, the what evolved out of that would be tetrapods, which have true limbs instead of fins that can support weight on land. So that's going to include amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. And mammals. So amphibians, those are going to be semi-aquatic. So for some purposes, such as reproduction, they still require water, and they may need to be kept moist because of their method of respiration. But for other things, they can exist on land as well. So those can include things like salamanders and frogs. Their lungs are not very well evolved compared to, say, like humans and fully terrestrial organisms. So they actually can respire through skin. But if you remember from learning about osmosis and diffusion, so if they diffuse gases through their skin, they're going to be intaking oxygen and diffusing out carbon dioxide. Diffusion is the rates of diffusion drastically drop off when you increase the distance between the objects needing diffusion. So that's not going to be, so this is sort of a consequence of their partial land and partial aquatic environment. And again, fertilization, so in frogs and toads, is external but takes place in the water. So the sperm is going to swim to the egg. And the eggs can also they have to be moist because they don't have a really like solid coating or to keep them from drying out, which we'll see in later organisms. In some amphibians, the fertilized egg then develops into an aquatic larvae, such as a tadpole of some frogs and toads. Interesting thing about salamanders is they can regenerate lost limbs. Um, Sicilians, Sicilians, they are amphibians, even though they look kind of like earthworms, but they are very much so in a completely different group. They have really small eyes, often covered by skin, and so their vision is really more so to detect light than to actually like see and identify the environment. And in the reptiles, they're truly adapted for life on land. And so those includes lizards, snakes, alligators, crocodiles, turtles, and birds. What helps them stay on land and fully adapt to that is going to be their tough, scaly skin that reduces water loss, as well as internal fertilization. So the male will be depositing sperm directly into the female's body. They also have a new kind of egg called the amniotic egg with a shell that stops, minimizes water loss or drying out on land. And to aid in this is an internal membrane called the amnion, that encloses the embryo in a watery environment. Because their skin is hard and dry and tough, they cannot respire through it. But they do have a three-chambered or four-chambered heart that can properly segregate or separate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, better so than amphibians do. If we go back, yeah, so amphibians, they have a three-chambered heart. Whereas reptiles, it can be three or four-chambered. Lizards and snakes form a distinct lineage, about 9,400 species. So the common ancestor for those two, um, lizards retain their legs, had limbs. Lizards retain their legs, their limbs, but snakes lost them. But you can see some remnants in some of the bones in a snake. Interesting thing about a snake, some can use venom that's used to immobilize prey, and it's done through special hollow teeth or fangs, basically. And then snakes can also sense sort of like the heat or the temperature difference between a prey and its surroundings, which can help it actually find its prey even if the prey is camouflaged and hiding beneath something. The heat difference between it and the environment can cause it to light up from the background. It also can help them uh, hunt at night too, especially since you're going to see a larger temperature difference at night between a warm-blooded animal and its environment. Turtles, they are unique for their shell, and it's box-like and it's fused to their vertebrae, ribs, and collarbones. So no, you cannot take a turtle out of its shell. Birds are a uh, closely distinct group of reptiles. So traditionally they were sort of separated out later on, but later on they we found out that birds actually really were closely more so reptiles than they were not reptiles. And so they're really a subset. They don't really look like traditional reptiles. But if you analyze their genetics and some of their shared characteristics, you would find out that they are more closely associated with reptiles than they are as a separate group. So, what distinguishes birds? Feathers, which are highly specialized modified scales. And modern birds will actually retain scales on their legs, which helps support the evidence of the ancestry they share with reptiles. So they're going to be light weight for their size. That's accomplished via lightweight bones. And then they have other adaptations such as um, shrinking their reproductive organs when they're not breeding to further like minimize weight. Feathers can also, in addition to certain kinds of feathers, aiding in flight. They're also really good at insulation for the body. What's interesting about birds as a subsection of reptiles, though, is that birds are endothermic. So they can maintain their body temperature independent of the external environment. And most times that body temperature is actually going to be uh, like higher or warmer than the environment. And so this is a consequence of uh, their metabolism, which is actually going to be than higher or faster than you are going to see in typically reptiles. So whereas you may see like like a turtle or a crocodile sunbathing to help bring its body temperature up because it can't regulate that by itself. It has to go bathe in the sun to absorb that heat. The metabolism of birds are actually going to be high or fast enough that it's actually going to generate a lot of heat as a byproduct, enough to maintain a normal body temperature independent of the environment. You're also going to see a well-developed four-chamber heart. And their respiratory system is a little bit unique as well, where there's a continuous supply of oxygenated air, even when they are exhaling out. And then the group you're probably most familiar with are going to be the mammals. What's unique about these is that they have hair and mammary glands, which females use to feed their young. Even though that they'd been around for quite a long time, 250 million years ago, they really didn't start to develop and diversify from like small like rodent creatures to the like wide diversity we have now. That didn't really happen till after the dinosaurs became extinct. Presumably when the dinosaurs as actual predators um, didn't allow created selective evolutionary pressure on mammals not diversifying into the full like set we see today. All right, so among mammals, there are going to be three lineages: the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placental mammals. Monotremes, they lay eggs rather than giving birth to live young, which makes them a little bit unique. They include the platypus and spiny anteater known uh, as echidnas. I don't know, very strange word. They're only found in New Guinea and Australia. So here we have spiny anteater and a platypus. Platypuses are known for being adapted to aquatic life. Monotremes, they lack nipples, however, still produce milk, but they come through ducts. And I would say probably a little bit less efficient than the nipple design. Marsupials, those are actually full of, I don't want to say the fun ones, but they are full, uh, they have the sort of fun ones. So things like kangaroos and wombats and Tasmanian devils. What's unique about them too is that they develop in the uterus for only a short period of time, and then it isn't until after birth where they crawl into a nipple and they grasp on it, and then they complete development outside of the womb. And most people think of kangaroos, they think of Australia. And in fact, the majority of the 330 species of marsupials are found in Australia. And then again, among all of the vertebrate animals, the ones you guys again are probably most familiar with are the placental mammals. So these you can find them in the sea, in the air, in the land. They are quite diverse as a group, and their placentas are actually more complex and more developed than marsupials. In fact, because they are more complex and more developed, they'll keep their young in the uterus for a much longer period of time so that the offspring are more developed at birth. But again, at the end of the day, like even placental mammals, they don't give birth to full adults. They give both birth to babies, which still have a developmental time before they reach full adult maturity. So there may be some pretty interesting facts about mammals, placental mammals that you probably didn't know about. Among these, rodents make up 40% of all mammal species. And so rodents, they're more than just like rats, but they include rats, mice, squirrels, hamsters, guinea pigs, porcupines, beavers, woodchucks, chipmunks, and voles, among others. And then the other interesting thing, especially since we're in the middle of a pandemic, most likely caused by a spillover event as a result of human interaction with bats. Yes, I'm talking about that virus, the coronavirus. Bats live with a whole set of different coronaviruses, different species of the virus, and they've learned to sort of uh, adapt with them and co-live, and it's a function of their reduced aggressiveness of their immune system to the viruses. So rather than them getting like really sick, they seem to function well with different like live viruses circulating through them. So about 20% of mammalian species are bats, and they are the only mammals to actually have wings and powered flight. They are nocturnal and they spend their daylight hours in caves, rocks, crevices, or trees. And this is another reason why it's so strange that humans would ever come across bats, is because we only run across them when they're sleeping. And well, I obviously have never really like gone and explored a cave. It may be an awesome experience, so I guess I won't judge too much. But again, one interesting thing is that rodents and bats make up the majority of mammals. And of course, they're also unique due to their echolocation ability. All right, that is about it for this chapter.